I'm Sarah Williamson, and this is Going Long with FCLT Global. On this show, you'll learn what it means to be long-term from the top minds in global business and investing. Leaders from companies and investment organizations join us to discuss how they are leading their teams for the long run on issues including capital allocation, risk management, climate change, and sustainability. To learn more, visit our website at fcltglobal.org. Carmine Di Sibio is the EY Global Chairman and CEO, leading over 284,000 people, serving clients in more than 150 countries. Prior to being elected chairman, Carmine served as EY Global Managing Partner, Client Service, leading the execution of the organization's global strategy. He also currently co-chairs the EY Global Diversity and Inclusiveness Steering Committee. Carmine is a member of the board of Focusing Capital in the Long Term, which of course matters a great deal to us, and he plays an active role in the World Economic Forum, serving as a member of its International Business Council. He's also a member of the Washington, D.C.-based U.S. Business Roundtable and has a BA from Colgate University and an MBA from NYU Stern School of Business. So Carmine, thank you very much for joining me today to talk about focusing capital in the long term and thinking about these long-term issues. We recognize that EY has been involved since the very beginning in this journey, starting from our early days as focusing capital on the long term. And now, of course, we're talking about this in an interesting time of great upheaval, whether we mean in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic or geopolitical tensions or the issues of social justice. So you do wear a couple of different hats. You run a very big organization that operates around the world. You lead a very large team. And then you also serve as an advisor to many of the world's companies. So if we think about the importance of being long-term and some of the issues that we have been talking about, first, if you think about it through your lens of leading EY, why are some of the reasons that EY places an importance on a long-term approach? And can you share some ways that you try to embody these principles in your work?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Sarah, and thanks for the nice introduction. So a couple of things, and actually how we run EY in terms of focused on the long term is really very much in line with how we advise our clients in terms of being focused on long term. But at EY, first of all, we have a strategy and a long-term strategy. And our strategy starts with our purpose. And our purpose is building a better working world. So everything we do, we want our people to think about, everything they're doing every day and how that builds a better working world. So, and when I say that, I don't mean just from a societal, charitable standpoint, but I mean in terms of, if one of our young auditors, every step they do in an audit process and so forth every day, we want them to think about how are they building a better working world? How are they ensuring the capital markets so the financials of a company are accurate? And that obviously gives confidence to the capital markets in terms of investors. And that's how they're really playing their part in building a better working world. So we at EY, and we also tell our clients that in today's world, you need to have a purpose. Why do you exist? What makes, your organization unique in terms of that purpose? And that's important. It's important to not only think for the long term, but it's important because our people and our, employees are demanding it. They want to work, everyone wants to work at a place that has a purpose. So then you go from having a purpose to a strategy. And today, our strategy at EY, we actually call it Next Wave, is really around the pillars of a long-term value framework. And that framework is built upon customers, our people, society, and financial. And and you have to think of everything we do in those pillars. So let's start with clients or customers. To us, everything we do is really geared around our clients and how do we serve our clients. That's our business. So we want to make sure that all our people are focused on clients, making sure that they're helping them solve their problems and so forth. So a lot of our strategy revolves around how do we serve our clients. The next pillar is around people, and how do we really hire, retain, and develop the best people for the long term? Back to your question, how do we really develop people? And look, I've been at EY for 35 years. That's, some people would consider that long term. But and today, not everyone's been there that long and so forth. But we want to make sure that we're recruiting the right people, we're training them so they can be at EY for the long term. So everything we do is geared towards people being at EY for 10, 20, 30 years, not for just a year or two. And I know some people, come out of school, they join a place like EY, and then after a couple of years they leave. We're actually trying to get away from that and think much more, how do we retain them more for the long term? And then the third pillar is around society. And what are we doing to better society? And what are our people doing? What are we doing as an organization? And this really gets into, everything from making sure that that we are helping our communities, making sure we're reinvesting in our communities. I actually just got off a call in terms of us hiring more and more people without college degrees that have specific skill sets. These are programs that are actually popping up around the country. We are involved in one in Virginia, and now we are also involved in a much bigger one in New York City. Us and IBM and McKinsey and Accenture and JP Morgan, in particular, Jamie Dimon's been very focused on this. And so what we're doing is we're hiring kids that do not have four-year college degrees. Most kids are minorities and are of color, and we're actually going to take them on and train them with the City University of New York in particular areas like particular technologies and so forth. That's all part of our societal pillar and part of our strategy in terms of how we move that forward. And that's important. That's a bit of who we are and so forth. And the fourth pillar is more of the finance operations piece where, we are a for-profit organization and we want to make sure that our strategy enables us to generate enough money that not only can we pay our people and our partners, but we could also reinvest for the long term. And that's important because today our business is not what it was 20, 30 years ago, where it's all just around people and there isn't a lot of investment needed except for investing in your people. Today, we have to invest in technology and we have to invest in transformational technologies. We have to invest in AI, robotics, blockchain, things like that, that do require investment. So we have to figure out how do we make enough money to reinvest into some of those things. So that's a little bit of it in a nutshell, our strategy, and the strategy is built for the long term from an EY perspective. Now, what we've done is we've taken that approach in terms of our strategy, and our strategy consultants that are out there, they're utilizing that framework to actually, service our clients and to advise our clients on how to really develop a long-term strategy for themselves.
And do you think that as you put those things in that order, so the long term clearly, but also the clients and your people and so on, and when you think about how that translates to other companies, obviously different companies have different sorts of supply chains and whatever it may be, but the order that you talked about there sounds very similar to the Business Roundtable statement that came out about a year ago. And so many people have seen that statement as simply a reflection of what companies were already doing. Some others have seen it as a real pivot away from the shareholder. How do you think about that, particularly as it relates to the companies that you advise? Is it building for the shareholder? Is it a real pivot? How do you parse that?
Yeah. I think Sarah, that question, I think the answer really depends on where you were, a year or two ago. I mean, some companies had already made the pivot. They were already focused on the long term, focused on all stakeholders, not just shareholders, and they were already moving that way. So I would say for them, it was, more of a statement of something they were already doing. Others, though, it was a real eye-opening experience in terms of what it really meant. And so, when you kind of double clicked on that a little bit, it's like, okay, well, all right, what does that really mean when we say all stakeholders? Well, that means the different pieces that I just mentioned. That means let's start with clients. Let's also talk about society. Let's talk about people. So that's all been evolving, and versus a year ago, more and more companies are trying to figure out, okay, how do they address all stakeholders, and not just shareholders. I'm in very few conversations now with any CEOs and any of our clients where they're solely focused on the shareholder. I never hear that. Now, you might say, well, sometimes that's just talk and they really are only focused on the shareholder. But in all my conversations with the CEOs I deal with, that's not the case. They have bought in that they have to do more. Business has to do more. And it comes right off the Business Roundtable statement. Now, with that, and you're very familiar with this, we are all trying to make that more tangible. So we are pushing our clients to disclose more around some of these metrics, in particular around ESG, so that basically there's more accountability on really driving your long-term strategy and driving for all stakeholders, not just earnings or earnings per share and so forth. So and you know this, but we've we and the other big four are working with the International Business Council to really help on the metrics. But there's SASB, there's different groups that are pushing on the metrics, and I do think if we could all come together and really come up with some metrics we could all agree on, as well as have companies sign up to the disclosures, I think that'll put more accountability on everyone and really move forward the stakeholder concept.
And do you think we're getting there in terms of making some progress? I mean, the way that, because as you said, EY obviously has done a lot of work on these metrics. The International Business Council has, FCLT has, particularly from the investor point of view. And I think that the trick is coming up with a reasonable list of metrics that are both sensible for companies to disclose and are also something that investors will actually pay attention to and take into account. So do you feel like we're getting there on that, as you think, particularly across countries? Clearly the Europeans and the Americans have sort of a different perspective across industries, across standard setters, and so on.
Yeah, so I think we're making progress. I do not think we're there, but I do think we're making progress. I think, everyone has, the best intentions on this. I was there at the International Business Council meeting at the World Economic Forum last year when basically we were using, the polling machines to see how many CEOs would actually sign up to this. And we had probably somewhere between 2/3 and 70% of them say that they would. Now this was, obviously it was a polling machine, so it wasn't like everyone could see exactly what you were voting, but that was encouraging. That was encouraging. So I do think we're making progress. Now the issue is of course, not all metrics fit each company so easily. My view on this, Sarah, is, well, we need to get started. So if you commit to disclosing, the metrics we're proposing, or whatever framework you like, maybe they don't all fit your business. So I'll give you an example. We're looking to disclose as much as we can from an EY perspective. One of the metrics that's in the the WEF proposal is around water usage. Okay. Now, if we're in some other business, that would really mean a lot in terms of the planet and everything else. From an EY perspective, water usage is, how much water do we drink at the water fountain? I mean, so it's probably not a big factor. So my view is on that metric, whether we could calculate something or can't, I might just put NA not relevant to our business and move forward. I think we can't get hung up here where every metric has to fit every single thing precisely, because we will never get there. And that's one of the problems that we're running into is, when people who are used to making financial disclosure, gap disclosures, and so forth, where there's very robust processes and things become legalistic, when they look at these metrics, want to apply the same really robustness to them, which is fine. They do need to be robust and they need to be real, but maybe some of them, these are what we're proposing. We're not regulators. So what we're proposing is that we move forward with what we can move forward, and then evolve from there. So for example, for EY on that metric, I might just say NA, and move forward.
Well, that makes perfect sense. And one of the things that I think is interesting about public companies is that publicly traded companies is, there's been so much discussion this year about employees and the importance of employees and health and safety of employees and so on. But for most companies, if you ask them, well, how many employees do you have? And how many of those are full-time, part-time contract? And these are fairly simple questions. Those are not disclosed. And so I think that there's a really interesting opportunity here for people who, like EY, who are used to real numbers that you can verify, like how many people work here, to extend beyond the financials. So we're excited about the efforts here, and think that if we can get some numbers that people can really rely on, that'll be really,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah, and it's depending on the particular sector you operate in, it's more difficult. I was having this conversation with one of the large private equity firms yesterday, and they're like, "Well, should we apply this just to the fund? Should we include all our investee companies? What about if we don't control them?" I mean, there are so many questions, and my answer is, just have a standard. Maybe it's the fund as well as the companies you control. And that's your standard, and then you're going to be consistent with that going forward. I mean, this is something that private equity firms don't get enough credit, but private equity firms provide so many jobs in this economy and so forth, and people don't realize the amount of jobs that they actually provide. So I would say you're shortchanging yourself if you're going to do these metrics at the fund level. I would be broader, as an example.
Yeah, that makes sense. So as we think about metrics shifting from more traditional financial only to broader, do you see governance shifting in any way to be more multi-stakeholder as well? And how does a corporate board, either in the United States or in other countries, how do they really represent the other stakeholders and really take their concerns into account? When at the end of the day, their terms will be voted on by the shareholders.
Well, I think this is where FCLT plays a big role as well. And the shareholders, in many cases, are the investors. And I think there is no doubt that investors are more and more concerned about the long term, and concerned about stakeholder, and not just the earnings for the next quarter. That's been something that obviously all the big asset managers are talking about, and you all are talking about. So that overall pressure is getting there in terms of the directors on many of these companies. And so we had a very large webcast with many of these directors on, in terms of more focused on the metrics, but also on the different pieces of what does it mean to be a board member today. What do you need to be focused on? And if you ask most directors today, while of course they would say, one of their main jobs is to make sure that they're protecting the shareholder and getting a return for the shareholder, they also feel the pressure and the need to make sure that all stakeholders are taken care of. And if you think about it, if you have no clients, you're not going to generate much revenue. So you have to be focused on clients and so forth. And people are more important than ever. And if you don't have if you're not keeping your people, training your people, and so board of directors are very focused on that. And then you get into societal, and I will tell you, and this is something that the pandemic is showing more and more, and actually what's going on in the world today is showing more, whether it's global tensions or whether it's, the racial situation in the US that's expanded broadly. Companies feel like they have to do more, and therefore board of directors feel like they have to do more. And so in many conversations now, when I'm going to board meetings, much of the board meeting is focused around the racial tension issue. What are we doing? Much of it is focused on the environment and what are we doing there. So I think, Sarah, the board of directors and board members are getting there and getting there quickly.
So when we talk to companies, sometimes they say they're trying to do the right thing. They're trying to make the right long-term decision. They're trying to figure it out, but they feel sources of pressure. Sometimes they name their board, but as you've said, a lot of boards are really moving. Sometimes they name their investors, but a lot of investors, at least big ones, are moving. Where do you see the hurdles or the pushback on this mindset coming from? Is it coming from outside of companies, or is it we've seen the enemy and it's us? I mean, is it, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. And this I've said before. I do think the let's call it the street or Wall Street, in particular analysts and so forth. I think they have to do more. Not only analysts, but also the media, the financial media. I think they have to do more in terms of really looking at things for the long term. And I think they have to have a mindset shift in terms of really gearing some of their analysis or a lot of their analysis around the long term. And so to me, that's going to be important, and that's more outside. I still think there's a lot of pressure from the Wall Street analysts and from the media in terms of short-term earnings, short-term projections. So you beat earnings per share by 2 cents. As opposed to them really looking at some things differently. So I think that's one piece. Now, internally, it's a transformation. Internally within companies, it's a transformation. So you're going to have more progressive thinkers around this and understanding what thinking for the long term and gearing the business really means. And then you're going to have some that are just more concerned, about the earnings for that quarter. But what I'm seeing is management that's only concerned that way, little by little, is getting moved out, and management that's concerned more around the long term is really moving in. I do think that's something that, when you look at even some of the changes that have been made and so forth, most of the people that are being put into some of these roles, these CEO roles and so forth, are strategic, are forward thinking. And I don't want to use names, but I can tell you that they're not just thinking of, earnings next quarter.
Well, and I think it's really clear that, EY's been on the leading edge of this, but 4 or 5 years ago, a lot of these issues weren't really on the front page of the paper. People were talking about them in some places and thinking deeply about them, but it has completely changed such that I would imagine, to your point, that there are not many boards where if some of these longer term issues were brought up, people would say, oh, that doesn't apply to us, or that's not relevant. Whereas as a few years ago, it might. So I think as we think about the changes in governance, obviously they're very different in different parts of the world. The Europeans often have representatives of other sorts of people on boards, whether it's representatives of labor. In some other countries, there are representatives of government on company boards, which is a different structure altogether. Do you think that those systems will converge in some way, or do you think that various governance systems will sort of keep on their own path, but just continue to evolve to be more forward thinking?
Yeah, I do not see those converging because first of all, I think there's so much history built in those, and so I just don't see it. I do not see U.S. boards involving labor and things like that. But but I don't really see that happening in the US. And then I also don't see Europe changing that in terms of getting rid of those people on the board. So I think they'll just continue to operate, but I do think the overall, the overall thoughts and so forth on the long term and so forth will continue in both places. It'll just be a little different in terms of board composition. I can't imagine that U.S. boards will go that way, and I also can't imagine that Europeans will drop, the labor person off the board. And it's amazing because you might argue that both systems kind of work. They've been there a long time and they kind of work. So that, I don't see it happening in terms of any kind of convergence.
Well, that makes sense. And I think that we see whether it's metrics or regulations or governance structures, there are some very big differences in the way things are done globally. And for each one to continue on its path and progress is probably a lot simpler than trying
Well,
to
I mean,
one to
this
convert
is
to another. Yeah.
there are a lot of differences. There's the chairman versus CEO concept, separating that out. That's been an age-old argument. Europe tends to be more separate. The U.S. tends to have those roles more together. You can make arguments both ways. Both ways can work, and that hasn't really converged either, really.
And then the last topic to touch on is this whole area of investor corporate engagement. So one of the things that is interesting that does cross countries and borders is that there are some very large global investors that obviously own companies around the world, and most companies actually have shareholders that are also around the world. So they may be operating across multiple regulatory jurisdictions, but increasingly we see a concentration of that institutional investment world. And we see increasing engagement, often broadening from, as you've said, what are you going to do this quarter, to how are you thinking about all of these various issues. If you project out, a few more years, how do you see the investor corporate engagement developing, and perhaps 3 or 5 years out? Do you think that will continue to be sort of two worlds that don't meet, or come together much more?
Well, I think I don't know if I'd use the word come together, Sarah, but I do think, look, there's more and more transparency between investors and corporates. There's more and more data. There's more and more ease of transparency. So I do think, from the perspective of investors understanding the companies better, and companies describing themselves using data better to investors, I think that will make things, I guess, come more together, because I do think we already live in, and we will continue to live in, a more transparent world from that perspective. And, I can give you examples. I mean, many companies today, their employees and so forth, there's so much that's going on at a company, and with their people. Social media is tons of data. And so investors are going to have more and more access to things like that. Investors are going to have more access to what employees think of the company they work for. There are many surveys that are internal. There are surveys that are done that are external, that are on social media. So the modern technology and data will give investors much more of a lens into a company than they had even just a few years ago. So I do think that's going to be different in the next few years. I think that will continue to build itself, and I do think that's a good thing. And it's something that I think is helpful. We get back to our EY purpose, building a better working world. It's something that will help the capital markets because of transparency. Now, with that, we also need to be careful, because there are companies that end up getting destroyed or getting their brand damaged and so forth because of the transparency, because of social media. So that's going to be something that we're going to be careful of going forward. But I think if that's what you mean by it'll come more together because of technology and data.
I think that this intersection between company disclosed data, which historically is what EY has worked on, and making sure that those numbers are right, and the alternative data, if you can call it that. In the old days, it was almost all company disclosed data, and now that is really shifting. So I think that I'm hopeful that's a reason companies will want to disclose more, because it's not as if the investors can't find it. So Carmine, as you look forward, and as we as Focusing Capital on the long term are trying to drive this idea of rewiring capital markets to support a long-term and sustainable economy, and you at EY are building a better working world, and other organizations are trying to push this forward, what do you see as the key milestones or priorities that we all ought to know, whether these efforts where we're all putting in a lot of time and resources into trying to make these improvements? What should we be looking for to see whether we're winning or losing, whether we're doing well or not?
Yeah, and this is that's a very good question. And when I look at some of the particular areas that are coming out of the COVID pandemic, and these were areas that were focused before the pandemic, but they're becoming very obvious in the pandemic. And I'll look at two specific areas that I think, if we do all this right, this all should be helpful. One's around income inequality. And I think if we do all this right, thinking for the long term, investing back in our businesses, it should create more jobs. It should create more jobs for everyone. And it should help in terms of income inequality, including some of the metrics around people, Sarah, that we talked about. And people are disclosing that. It'll give more accountability around that. I think at the Business Roundtable, we're talking more and more about, minimum wage and a national minimum wage, and the time has come for those things to get put in place. And I do think, these are all kind of tools and things that we should be doing. Let's take it for the societal piece that will create more jobs and will frankly help in terms of income inequality and help all boats to rise in a good, in good times. So that would be one. And the second is around the environment. I do think, a lot of what we're doing, a lot of what companies are doing, are focused on the long term and are focused on the environment. And the environment is something that's obviously incredibly important to us and to our kids and to our kids' kids. And if we, again, looking at some of the things that there's been a lot of focus on, if we do the right things, I think we should see improvement in carbon emissions, as we go forward, which will improve the planet and will improve, all things. So those are just two areas that I think we should be able to see progress on if we do all this right.
Right. All right. Well, we'll watch them carefully, and we will continue to push on all of these tools and levers that drive us that way. And we're really grateful to you personally for the time and effort you put into these issues, and for EY. I think that having EY's leadership in the business community and among its own employees is just critical. So thank you for your time today, and thank you mostly for your leadership.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for your leadership and everything you do at FCLT.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Going Long with FCLT Global. Be sure to hit subscribe to get new episodes every other Monday. To learn more, visit our website at fcltglobal.org.